Hello, my name is Mage, and welcome to a spooky Savine edition of Black and White Thinking. Today we are going to combine the truly witchy and the very bisexual as we delve into the history of the beast himself, one Aleister Crowley. A controversial and perhaps somewhat misunderstood figure from just over 100 years ago. A writer and occultist who had a batshit bi life. This story is wild. I always love talking about Aleister Crowley, and so I thought this would be a great piece of ugly bisexual history to share this Halloween, the most wonderful time of the year. So settle around the hearth as we discuss how a young boy from England, with the dream of becoming a mountain climber, would grow to be known as the wickedest man alive. Aleister Crowley was born Edward Alexander Crowley in Royal Leamington Spa, Warwickshire, a small-ish town in England, on October 12, 1875. The only child of strict religious parents. A life lived underneath the boot of his parents and the righteous hand of the church, a young Edward would be known as a rebellious child. Although it's not hard to see why when you begin to look into the values of his father's strict Protestant denomination. They were known as the Plymouth Brethren, and they were super into biblical literalism. It would be hard to ignore the semi-abusive ways in which these people thought a child should be raised in order to be worthy of God's love. Changing his name to Aleister, smoking, being caught with girls, prostitutes, was just the beginning for a young boy whose rebellion against a strict Christian upbringing would essentially shape his life. And beyond that, it would shape the world of the mystic and the occult forever. Aleister was essentially a Victorian edgelord, a young boy with little to do but to fight back against the oppressions of the shitty adults around him. The Bible, its strict teachings, were the enemy of a boy who was deep into his teen angst amidst the modest propriety of Victorian England. When Aleister's father died when he was about 11, his relationship with his mother would get significantly worse. Now, it's worth noting early on in the video that anything I credit to having come out of Aleister Crowley's mouth is questionable. The man spent a lot of time crying wolf, and it did not do him justice when he actually was innocent of things and had spent a lot of time trying to convince people he was the devil. But when he was younger, he talked about how his mum often referred to him as a little beast, and this is where he got the idea from to proclaim himself the Beast 666. To take the insult of his Puritan mother and annoy her with it. The first rebel against the tyrannous Christian god, as a young Aleister saw it, was Lucifer Morningstar himself. That didn't make the devil wrong in his eyes, it made him righteous. As I said, the cold boot under which Aleister was raised only made him grow to disdain the one thing his parents actually wanted him to love, the man above and the church in which he represented. At around age 15, after having been sent off to boarding school after his father's death and his younger sister's death, Aleister's mother was pretty much done with him and she sent him to live in Eastbourne
from my hometown
with a family friend who was working at private school as a chemistry teacher. Eastbourne was good for Crowley. He enjoyed Sussex. He'd been there when he was younger, and the cliffs of Eastbourne gave him a chance to practice something he loved and was good at, mountaineering. He would continue whoring around, smoking, drinking whilst he was in Sussex, but he would also get a lot done. In 1894, he would scale Beachy Head, which is a feat, and would use the knowledge gained there to then go on to climb the Alps. And he would climb many mountains in his lifetime. I honestly think it's one of the stranger facts about him that he was just really good at mountain climbing, alongside some of the crazy stuff we're about to get into. The year after climbing Beachy Head, he headed to Cambridge, and he was there for 3 years, but never technically finished because he was too busy getting into the occult. In 1966, in the midst of his tenure at Cambridge, he had his first, what he would call, mystic experience in 1896. It would also be at Cambridge that he would realise he was bisexual after having a relationship and dating for quite a while the leader of the Footlights at Cambridge. Truly the type of English bisexuality I am here for. It was also around this time he caught syphilis, which means by the time that Aleister was about 18, he had gonorrhea and syphilis, which you can only imagine what that would do to someone's mind. I always feel like that has a lot to do with Aleister's inability to fit in socially. He never fit in socially, and a lot of the disdain for him as a person in Victorian England comes from that. But I don't think the STIs, untreated as I imagine they were, helped. In 97, he visited Russia. He wanted to work there, but he gave it up after he started reading again about the occult. He got so obsessed that he essentially gave up all of his life goals to pursue that. And he was good when it came to studying the occult and expanding on the occult. Aleister Crowley, even when his mind was not working well, was never stupid. After leaving Cambridge, he joined a cult, an order called the Order of the Golden Dawn. Secret societies were very much popping up at that time, and this one would include W.B. Yeats of all people. Why Aleister joined this cult specifically has been surrounded with rumours for years. I will touch on them again later when it becomes more relevant. But he did. He joined this secret society and infiltrated it not just through tyranny at meetings, but also by banging one of the guys in charge. And he quite literally claimed squatters' rights on this secret society when Yeats tried to kick him out. Aleister was known, and this will come up again and again in his life, for being quite belligerent when he knew he was right. He was incredibly stubborn, and stubbornness was not enjoyed at this secret society, and everyone there essentially thought he was nuts. So as I said, he claimed squatters' rights and literally refused to leave the building they had rented out for their secret society until a court removed him. He ended up leaving with a few members, but this left him completely isolated from other occultists in the UK at the time. So with a few escaped members of the Order of the Dawn, Aleister Crowley began travelling around the world, and Crowley would continue to travel the world until he came back to Sussex to die. Over the next few years, he would climb mountains, visit Mexico, Paris, India, get really sick over and over again. At one point, he even tried to climb K2, which had never been climbed at that point. They didn't get very far. They had to turn back at 20,000 feet, but it was quite an achievement at its time. In 1903, he would marry a woman called Rose Kelly to save her, essentially, from an arranged marriage to an even bigger arsehole. Crowley actually came to love Rose a lot, and their honeymoon was him trying to take her across the world to prove it. And this is where one of my favourite part of Aleister Crowley's life happens. On his honeymoon, he took Rose all over the world. And Rose was not really into the occult. Like I said, they were not made for each other. He had essentially married her to do her a favour, but there they were in the early 1900s, married. So on their honeymoon, where he was trying to woo his new wife, and again, grain of salt, a lot of what we know about Crowley comes from his own journals, or people that hate him. Neither source is unbiased. But as the story is told by Aleister Crowley himself, they headed to Cairo, convinced some local Egyptian hoteliers that they were English royalty, and while staying at this hotel in Cairo, they not only convinced someone to sneak them into the king's chamber at one point in the Great Pyramid, but they also set up an altar in the room where they could play around with the old Egyptian gods, so to speak. And as the story goes, Aleister's wife thought this was totally nuts until she began mumbling and going into a trance, chanting, "They are waiting for you, they are waiting for you." A few days later, she explained that she thought they might be the god Horus talking to her. Aleister Crowley was really annoyed about this at the time. He was annoyed that he hadn't been touched by the gods, and instead it had been someone that didn't actually care, which I think is hysterical, because either she was having these strange visions, or she was just trying to annoy him, and it worked. A few days after that, he took her to a museum in Egypt. He wanted her to point out what she had seen in these visions, and she did, supposedly, pointing to an exhibit labelled with the number 666. Like I said, pinch of salt. From that moment on, things changed Crowley. He decided he was touched. They clearly did a lot of opium in Egypt at the time, and Crowley may not go into as much detail about that in these parts of his diaries, but it's definitely worth noting. From this moment, he began to claim that he had not only been touched by the gods and had been chosen by the gods, but that he was talking to them, conversing with them, that he was channeling them. And as they both fell further into delusion, and Crowley more involved with his mysticism, they had their first child, who they named Lilith. Crowley would begin to write this all down. all his visions and thoughts around occultism and the gods and the esoteric. And it would become known as the Book of Lore, a book he says was written through him, not by him. And this would be the cornerstone of the cult, say, religion that Crowley himself would start, known as Thelema.
Your hell is full of roses from the dew forwardly dark, the sorcerers enchanting and the paladin entranced. In the starlight as we wove us in a web of silk and steel, immemorial as the marble in the halls of Boabdil.
So what is Thelema? Aleister Crowley invented his own religion, but what does it look like? What kind of religion is it? What codes does it follow? What deities does it worship? And how does one practice it? To cut a very long story short, Thelema is essentially a pagan offshoot, kind of similar to Wiccan. It is hermetic in nature, esoteric, and occultist. Big words with wandering definitions. There are many deities within the religion that one may connect with, and Aleister Crowley believed himself to be a prophet and voice for these higher beings. Much like the Order of the Golden Dawn and other secret societies like it, Thelema had order, roles in which you could move about. But Thelema was different, simply for its focus on sex magic and pagan practices. Crowley would begin to record his religion, but he saw it channeled through him, into texts, throughout the early 1900s. The first being the Book of Lore. Nothing in Thelema comes from an original source. It is true paganism in the way it has endless bounds, and sees spiritualism as one collective practice. All gods from all places, simply earthly representations of higher powers, all people connected through the cosmos whether they like it or not. Thelema had a few important deities, a few important ways to worship them, and a few important rules to follow as you did. The ethical backbone of Thelema was the statement, "Do what thou wilt," which is a clear reference to Hermetic texts, Theosophy, and a bunch of other pre-Crowley mysticism. Crowley's texts were very inspired by those that came before. This is not a dig or a secret, it's just a fact. Crowley's texts on Thelema essentially boil the religion down to doing what one wants in the pursuit of love, communing with the gods, many who were Egyptian, Mesopotamian, or bastardized elements of Christianity, allowed Thelemites to do this, and their communion would involve chanting, meditation, divination, spirit work, astral projection, tarot, and I know I've said it a lot, but it really was the most crucial part of the practice. Aleister Crowley believed that the best way to commune with higher deities was to have lots of bisexual sex. He also incorporated, or appropriated, depending where you personally sit on the issue, lots of pieces of other religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, etc., as well as many of the old cults and religions that didn't actually survive to this day as well, Hermeticism, Gnosticism, and everything else I've mentioned, the ancient Egyptian cults, etc. Aleister Crowley also wrote into Thelema the concept of true will, the idea that people had a true desire and purpose outside of the ego. A lot of modern paganism is Jungian, and Thelema is no exception. And although I have called Crowley a hedonist in this video, he definitely was personally. The idea of do what thou wilt and following one's true will was not actually hedonistic. It was essentially about self-improvement, constantly moving towards the version of yourself that should exist, the one untainted by shame or society. Thelema also heavily centers around magic, and any practicing Thelemite would likely consider themselves some kind of practitioner in that area. Thelemites are sex-having, Egyptian-worshipping pagans. Moving on. It would take a few years for him to kind of gather the knowledge and writing to really gather a following around his own religion. And in this time, he would continue to travel across the world, and particularly across Asia. And it was whilst on these travels that another moment in Crowley's life that would have significance on not only his own view of the world, but how people came to see him. There is a mountain in the Himalayas of Nepal called Kanchenjunga. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And it is generally considered to be one of the most dangerous mountains in the world. And Crowley and his mates essentially decided they were going to climb it. Whilst they were beginning to climb it, Crowley was being stubborn, his usual self. Nothing particular, but he was annoying everyone. And there was a lot of frustration in the group just because Aleister Crowley was there. One night, the mountaineers all had an argument and they split into two groups. Crowley's group, who stayed on the mountain, and another group who was so annoyed at him they wanted to leave. Now, Crowley warned them that the mountain was too dangerous to leave at that point, and that they were better off just sticking up with his arseholery than risking death on the mountain, but they didn't listen because he was that much of an arsehole, and they died in an accident on the way down. And Crowley never recovered from this in the mountaineering world. He was never really trusted again, even though he hadn't killed these people. The idea that he could be so annoying that people would risk death just to get away from him said a lot about his social skills at the time, and for the rich white Victorian men that were mountaineering at the time across Asia, he was not high society enough for them, even though he was high society. After this, over the next few years, Crowley would continue to lay down the foundations of Thelema, have multiple affairs, his daughter would die, which would drive him and Rose apart, and they would eventually get divorced. Crowley and Rose would not divorce until 1909, but over the years their relationship dwindled. The death of their child messed both of them up. Rose would fall into the bottle, and Crowley would fall further into creating his own religion and a lot of gay sex. And I think at this point it's best to mention Crowley's bisexuality for what it was, and how it was treated at the time, and why there are such pervasive rumours around Crowley. As I've said, Crowley has a terrible reputation. At least he did when he was alive. And that reputation still kind of exists today. People tend to write him off either as a genius misunderstood, meow meow, or as a narcissist psychopath who inspires your children to rape and murder. I would argue that neither of these things are true. He was an incredibly mentally ill queer guy who did not fit in among the upper echelons of high Victorian society, especially the Puritan side of high Victorian society that he was unfortunately born into. He was a weirdo. If I had to guess, he was probably a diagnosable weirdo. And I say that with love in my heart as someone that is also a diagnosable weirdo. He was also bisexual, and proudly and outwardly so. He was incredibly into sex. He thought sex was a good thing. He thought it was a religious thing. He thought that there was magic to be made through sex, both with women and men, and he did not keep this a secret. He enjoyed quite graphic BDSM intercourse with men that he would name. And again, this was the Victorian era, soon to be Edwardian, but at this point still Victorian. And this type of stuff was not only frowned upon, it was criminal. And the fact that Crowley kind of got away with what he did in regards to just being a free-loving, drug-taking, sexual deviant was because he protected himself by talking a lot of bullshit. It's hard to tell where the truth ends and the lies start with Crowley. Aleister Crowley wasn't stupid, and throughout his life, he often tried to play society's views of him against society itself. And this didn't always work in his favour. I'm not going to pretend it did. It actually backfired in a lot of ways, especially in his later life. Aleister Crowley was an arsehole because he was rude to people, not because he was a bisexual deviant or because he thought that Satan was interesting. Aleister Crowley was essentially the first person to suffer under the lens of a satanic panic, if you do not include the witch trials that came before that, which are kind of a different issue, right? But there is a reason that Aleister Crowley has become an idol for a lot of queer goths, and that was because he was a queer goth. Throughout the rest of Crowley's life, the British press would hound him as the most evil man alive, as a Satanist sent to destroy British Christianity, as, and this is a quote, the most blasphemous and cold-blooded villain of modern times. This was because he wrote sex poetry and kissed boys, not because he was an advocate for anything violent. Newspapers got really into the idea he was an advocate for human sacrifice at one point, which Crowley played into greatly, but in a very camp way, let's say. Over the next 10 years, Crowley would do much as the same before. He would continue to travel all over the world, from America to Europe to Asia, having sex with anyone that would let him, doing a lot of drugs, and writing his books. Some of which are genuinely interesting, especially from the perspective of someone that is interested in either mysticism or mythology. Whether you are academically into spiritualism or just into spiritualism, Crowley's works are truly fascinating, and I would highly recommend actually reading them. His work and his life was vast though, and to touch on all of it would probably take me days. But it was over this next decade, across the period of the First World War, that the grounds for Thelema were really laid. It was also in World War I when Crowley was labelled true enemy of the British people and not just an evil bastard, because he began to write for a German paper. However, there are lots of questions around whether or not Crowley was ever on the German side in World War I. I mean, it doesn't really matter regardless. I don't think it makes much difference that he wrote for a German newspaper or not, but his proclivities to the German side in the First World War, and, as I mentioned before, his sudden involvement in the Order of the Golden Dawn have been rumoured to, and again, pinch of salt, have been rumoured to be things that he did at the Order of the British State. There are heavy implications in historical records that Aleister Crowley was also a spy, which, yeah, this man's life, mental. In 1920, after some time in America, Crowley brought a bunch of his followers home, and it's here where we can really say that he started his religion, where people began to follow him. And where we can say that Aleister Crowley started his own bisexual commune. Now, I've called it cult a few times, and I've called it a religion. Thelema itself, the texts are religious. They are a look into the occult. They are religious. I don't think it would be hard to argue that. The Abbey of Thelema, the group of people I'm about to describe who went to live in Sicily with Aleister Crowley to do drugs and have lots of bisex, that might have been a cult. Aleister Crowley went and bought a piece of land in Sicily in 1920 where he took a bunch of his followers to live and practice Thelema. They would practice it, they had silly robes and they would do special rituals at different times of the day, but they would also paint and write, have sex, educate their children, and all the other things you can expect of a cult. There was sex magic going on, prostitution, more drugs. It was at this point that Aleister Crowley moved from heroin to also doing a lot of cocaine, so much that it began to erode his navel cavity, which is gross. The building became dilapidated. There were wild animals walking around, dogs, cats, mice, birds, children running around half naked, parents doing drugs, nobody cleaning. And it all soon fell apart. The whole thing lasted about 3 years, and as more people arrived and realised that Crowley and his mates were just rotting away in the forest, the whole thing began to fall apart. It really fell apart when a young Themalite named Rao Loveday moved to the Abbey with his wife who hated Crowley. And he died pretty quickly upon arrival. Betty May, Loveday's wife, essentially managed to end the cult overnight. She went home to London and sold her story to the press that already hated Aleister Crowley. She said that her husband had died because he had drank cat's blood and they were being forced to harm themselves and use only the pronoun I. Usually I would believe this stuff, but there's very little actual evidence for any cat blood drinking going on in the commune, and what it actually seems to have happened was that Loveday drank from a local polluted stream because they had no running water and were not looking after themselves because they were all off their faces on drugs, which seems the more likely of the two. The British press did not care though, and in the usual satanic panic fashion, they went with animal sacrifice instead of cholera. John Ball, one of the most famous British newspapers at the time, would proclaim Crowley the wickedest man alive and one they'd like to hang. Crowley really wanted to sue them, but he had no money because he spent it all on drugs and buying this piece of land in Sicily where he could rot with his mates, and couldn't do anything about it. These attacks went viral as anything could in 1923, being reported internationally in every paper that Crowley forced people to sacrifice and drink animals' blood and therefore they died. Even though there is no proof of this, but again, does the press care? No, not even when it comes to Aleister Crowley. And at the time Mussolini got wind of this and found that Aleister Crowley was living in Sicily, he had him deported. Because apparently even Mussolini thought that Aleister Crowley was a shit. Which again, it might be at this point that I definitely take Crowley's side. Not to be too biased in my historical video. And neither to defend Aleister Crowley. He definitely doesn't need it. But if Mussolini thinks you're a bit of a weirdo, you might be doing something right. Crowley would never recover from this. The whole thing would fall through. He would continue to write his books. He would continue to have different relationships with different people for the rest of his life, who were all into his work, but not as much as he was. If there was anything Aleister Crowley loved more than sex and drugs, it was attention. In 1930, he would even fake his own death for 3 weeks, only to show up at the opening of an art exhibition and announce himself reappeared. And it worked at the time. It was all over the news. Aleister Crowley, not dead. Aleister Crowley returns. And he did stuff like this forever. He would write something, spend all his money on drugs, go bankrupt, have to do something worth writing about again, and repeat the cycle. And he would do this until he died, essentially. But he would never quite recover. He would produce some of his best work after the Abbey of Thelema fell through. Things like Magick in theory and practice, which didn't really do anything at the time. No one cared. It was just a weird book that weird man wrote, but is now considered the backbone of modern occultism. Crowley would become sober for a few years, and he would make a friend named Deirdre Doherty, who would offer to bear his child, and this would be the only child, Randall, of Crowley's that would ever grow to see adulthood. And throughout his life, this was clearly something that haunted him. He had multiple children, multiple women he had got pregnant, had miscarriages, but none of those children ever survived past the age of about 5 or 6. And this clearly haunted Crowley. Having met someone who was his friend, who he could have a child with in a later life, and seeing that child live, definitely gave him a few later years. Crowley's life would become a lot more chill after this. He would become known as more of a literary figure, hanging out with other people of a similar ilk, making friends in England for the first time, continuing his work but without starting a cult, and founding a life for himself in Sussex, a place that he loved. It's here he would be able to really hone in on the ideas he had made in his early years whilst off his face. He would be able to make real connections between ancient religions, paganisms, and modern religious texts. And he was good at it. He was no less or more worthy of being remembered as a mythologist than someone like Robert Graves or Joseph Campbell. He was just a bit crazier. And perhaps being honest in that crazy is what was his biggest downfall. Because whilst Crowley's life would improve in his later years in terms of making friends and living day to day, he would never recover his fame. He would never get any attention again, and he would essentially die penniless in a boarding house. Unfortunately for him, so much controversy exists around his life and all the things he did or did not get up to that often people overlook his work. And you do not have to be a follower of Thelema, a Thelemite as they are known, to see its worth in a greater story of mysticism, especially mysticism that is written from a British perspective. Crowley was a great symbol of the empire, but before there was the empire, there were tiny green islands full of witches. And Crowley did a lot, especially in regards to the New Age pagan movement, in connecting different parts of naturalism and esotericism from different cultures. His religion was one created from maternal worship and bisexuality. And as someone who personally views the mystical and mythological in the same regard, I can't help but feel slightly akin to some of the notions of Crowley's life. Even if he was a hedonist, I do not think he was the wickedest man alive. Aleister Crowley was wild. At heart, he was a queer anarchist who wanted nothing more than to annoy the uptight pseudo-Christian society that existed within England at the time. He was also a total weirdo and would come to inspire weirdos like him to do weird things for eons. Aleister Crowley was definitely a bisexual hedonist. He was an edgelord, a total fuckboy. But his story is also one about masculinity beneath the eye of an empire, one about bisexuality and seeing bisexuality as holy. And that's why in all of his ugly glory, Aleister Crowley has a proud place in bisexual history, and his story is a great one to reflect on at this time of year. First, let praise and worship and honour and glory and great thank be given unto the Holy One, who hath permitted us to come thus far, who hath revealed unto us the ineffable mysteries, that they might be disclosed before men. And we humbly beseech his infinite goodness, that he will be blessed to manifest unto us even the mystery of the first ether. The veil of the ether is like the veil of night, dark azure, full of countless stars. And because the veil is infinite, at first one seeth not the winged globe of the sun that burneth in the centre thereof. Profound peace filleth me, beyond ecstasy, beyond thought, beyond being itself, Iada. Yes, there is peace. There is no tendency of any sort, much less any observation of feeling or impression. There is only a faint consciousness, like the scent of jasmine. The body of the seer is rested in a waking sleep that is deeper than sleep, and his mind is still. He seems like a well in the desert, shaded by windless palms. and it is night, and because the night is the whole night of space, and not the partial night of earth, there is no thought for dawn. For the light of the sun maketh illusion, blinding man's eye to the glory of the stars, and unless he be in the shadow of the earth, he cannot see the stars. So also, unless he be hidden from the light of life, he cannot behold Nut. Here then do I abide, in unalterable midnight, utterly at peace. I've forgotten where I am, and who I am. I am hanging in nothing, now the veil opens of itself. It is a little child, covered with lilies and roses. He is supported by countless myriads of archangels. The archangels are all the same colourless brilliance, and every one of them is blind. Below the archangels are many, many other legions, and so on far below, so far that the eye cannot pierce, and on his forehead, and on his heart, and in his hand is the secret sigil of the beast. And of all this the glory is so great that all the spiritual senses fail, and the reflections in the body fail. It is very strange. In my heart is rapture, holy and ineffable, absolutely beyond emotion, beyond even that bliss called Ananda, infinitely calm and pure. Yet at the gates of mine eyes stand tears, like warriors upon the watch, that lean on their spears, listening. The great and terrible angel keeps on looking at me, as if to bar me from the vision. There is another, forcing my head down in sleep. I've gone up again to the child, led by two angels, abasing my head. The child seems to be the child that one attempted to describe in the Garden of Janus. Every volition is inhibited. I have tried to say a lot, but it has always got lost on the way. Holy art thou, O more beautiful than all the stars of the night. There has never been such peace, such silence. But these are positive things, singing praises of things eternal amid the flames of first glory, and every note of every song is a fresh flower in the garland of peace. This child danceth not, but it is because he is the soul of the two dances, the right hand and the left hand, and in him they are one dance, the dance without motion. There is dew on all the fire, every drop is the quintessence of the ecstasy of stars. Yet, a third time, am I led to him, prostrating myself 7 times at every step. There is a perfume in the air, reflected down even to the body of the seer. That perfume thrills his body with an ecstasy that is like love, like sleep, and this is the song. I am the child who am the father of all, for from me come forth all things, that I might be. I am the fountain in the snows, I am the eternal sea. I am the lover and the beloved, I am the first fruits of their love. I am the first shuddering of the light, and I am the loom wherein night weaveth her impenetrable veil. I am the captain of the hosts of eternity, of the swordsmen and the spearmen and the bowmen and the charioteers. I have led the armies of the east against the armies of the west, and the armies of the west against the armies of the east, for I am peace. My groves of olive were planted by a harlot, and my horses were bred by a thief. I have trained my vines upon the spears of the Most High, and with my laughter I have slain 1,000 men. With the wine in my cup I have mixed the lightnings, and I have carved my bread with a sharp sword. With my folly have I undone the wisdom of the Magus, even as with my judgments I have overwhelmed the universe. I have eaten the pomegranate in the house of Ra, and I have crushed out the blood of my mother between millstones to make bread. There is nothing that I have not trampled beneath my feet. There is nothing that I have not set a garland on my brow. I have wound all things about my waist as a girdle. I have hidden all things in the cave of my heart. I have slain all things because I am innocent. I have lain with all things because I am untouched virginity. I have given birth to all things because I am death. Stainless are my lips, for they are redder than the purple of the vine, and of the blood wherewith I am intoxicated. Stainless is my forehead, for it is whiter than the wind and the dew that cooleth it. I am light, and I am night, and I am that which is beyond them. I am speech, and I am silent, and I am that which is beyond them. I am life, and I am death, and I am that which is beyond them. I am war, I am peace, and I am that which is beyond them. I am weakness, and I am strength, and I am that which is beyond them.